I'm Sarah Chen, 28 years old, and the day federal agents knocked on my cousin's door asking for me should have been terrifying. Instead, it was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. For 3 years, my family had called my job a fantasy, dismissed my career as playing pretend on computers, and treated me like I was living in some elaborate delusion. But when Agent Rodriguez flashed his badge and asked where they could find me, suddenly my fake job became very real. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the tech-obsessed daughter in the Chen family wasn't exactly a recipe for acceptance. My parents, David and Linda Chen, owned a successful chain of traditional Chinese restaurants across the Pacific Northwest. They understood tangible businesses, physical products, customers you could see, and touch. What they didn't understand was their eldest daughter spending 18 hours a day staring at screens, typing code that looked like hieroglyphics to them, and insisting this was somehow a legitimate career path. My younger brother Kevin had it easy. He followed the script perfectly, studying business management in college before joining the family restaurant empire. Kevin understood profit margins, inventory management, and employee scheduling. He could explain his work to our grandmother in 3 sentences, and she would nod approvingly while ladling more rice into his bowl. Meanwhile, I would try to explain cybersecurity protocols or network vulnerability assessments, and the entire table would exchange those looks, the ones that said Sarah's lost in her computer world again. The divide started early. While other kids my age were playing with dolls or learning piano, I was dismantling old computers my dad brought home from restaurant office upgrades. I taught myself basic programming at age 12, built my first website at 14, and by 16, I was already freelancing for small businesses that needed help with their digital security. My parents saw it as an expensive hobby that kept me isolated from real-world experiences. High school guidance counselors pushed me toward practical majors like accounting or nursing, careers with clear job descriptions and reliable paychecks. But I knew my calling lay in the invisible digital infrastructure that kept the modern world functioning. While my classmates worried about prom themes and college parties, I was studying advanced encryption methods and attending online conferences. About emerging cyber threats, the real tension began during my junior year when I started talking about cybersecurity as my intended career path. My father would shake his head whenever the topic came up at dinner. "Sarah," he would say in his patient but frustrated tone, "you need to think realistically about your future. Computers are fine as a hobby, but you need a real job, something stable that people can understand." My mother took a different approach, suggesting compromises that missed the point entirely. "Maybe you could work in the restaurant offices," she would offer hopefully. "We could use someone to help with our computer systems, keep track of online orders." The fact that managing a restaurant's basic IT needs was nowhere near the same universe as cybersecurity analysis seemed lost on her. College provided some respite from family skepticism. At Pacific Northwest University, I found professors who understood the critical importance of digital security and classmates who spoke my language. My computer science program was rigorous and demanding, requiring not just technical skills but strategic thinking about how to protect complex systems from increasingly sophisticated threats. During my sophomore year, I landed an internship with a mid-sized tech company that specialized in financial security software. The work was challenging and meaningful, helping protect millions of dollars in digital transactions from hackers and fraud attempts. I spent that summer learning about advanced threat detection, incident response protocols, and the delicate balance between security and user accessibility. When I came home that fall, excited to share what I had learned and the positive feedback I had received from my supervisors, my family's reaction was predictably underwhelming. My father asked if the internship paid well, and when I explained it was primarily for experience and course credit, he shook his head disapprovingly. Kevin, who had spent his summer managing one of our restaurant locations and earning a solid salary, became the inevitable comparison point. "Your brother learned real business skills this summer," my mother pointed out during one particularly frustrating dinner conversation. "He can show us exactly how his work contributed to our profits. But what exactly did you accomplish with all those hours on the computer?" The question stung because I couldn't easily quantify prevented cyber attacks or explain how my work had protected customer data in terms they would find meaningful. My senior year brought new opportunities and deeper family misunderstanding. I was selected for an advanced cybersecurity research project that involved working with government contractors on classified defense systems. The work required security, clearances, background checks, and signing agreements that prevented me from discussing specific details of what I was doing. This secrecy became another source of family frustration. "If your job is so important," my father would challenge, "why can't you tell us what you actually do all day?" The fact that I literally couldn't discuss my work due to national security considerations seemed like a convenient excuse to them rather than a legitimate professional requirement. Graduation approached with the usual family expectations about my future plans. Kevin had already been promoted to regional manager of our restaurant group, with clear advancement opportunities and a path toward eventually taking over the family business. When I announced that I had accepted a position with a cybersecurity consulting firm that worked primarily with government agencies, the reaction was mixed at best. The salary was respectable, though not extraordinary for someone fresh out of college. More importantly to me, the work was fascinating and vital. Our firm specialized in identifying vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure systems, the kind of digital backbone that kept power grids functioning, water treatment plants operating, and financial networks secure. We were the invisible guardians protecting systems that millions of people depended on without ever thinking about. But try explaining critical infrastructure protection to relatives who measure career success by how quickly you can afford a house down payment and new car. My first year at Secure Dynamics Solutions was professionally rewarding, but personally isolating. I was learning from some of the brightest minds in cybersecurity, working on projects that genuinely mattered for national security, and building expertise in areas that were becoming increasingly crucial as more of society moved online. Family gatherings became exercises in diplomatic deflection. When relatives asked about my job, I learned to offer simplified explanations that sounded less mysterious and more conventional. I help companies protect their computer systems from hackers, I would say, which was technically accurate, but missed the scope and importance of what I actually did. The real problems started during my second year when our firm began taking on more sensitive projects. My security clearance was upgraded, requiring even more extensive background investigations and stricter guidelines about discussing work details. Simultaneously, the nature of our projects became more complex and higher stakes. We weren't just protecting individual companies anymore. We were working directly with federal agencies to identify and neutralize serious threats to national security. This evolution in my career coincided with increased family pressure about my life choices. Kevin had gotten engaged to his college girlfriend, and they were planning a traditional wedding that perfectly fit our parents' expectations. He was succeeding by every conventional measure, building a life that our extended family could easily understand and celebrate. Meanwhile, I was working longer hours on projects I couldn't discuss, traveling frequently to locations I couldn't name, and collaborating with colleagues whose full job titles I wasn't supposed to reveal. From the outside, it probably did look like I was making up elaborate stories about my importance and responsibilities. The breaking point came during my cousin Michelle's engagement party 18 months ago. Extended family had gathered from across the country, and the inevitable career comparison conversations began almost immediately. Kevin proudly displayed photos of the new restaurant location he was opening, complete with architectural plans and projected revenue figures that impressed everyone in attendance. When attention turned to me, I tried to explain my recent promotion to senior analyst and the increased responsibilities that came with it. My uncle Robert, who owned a successful construction company, listened politely before asking the question that would haunt our family dynamics for the next year and a half. "So, Sarah," he said with the kind of patronizing smile adults use when humoring children, "what exactly do you do that's so secret and important? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you spend all day playing computer games and making up stories about how crucial you are." The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it was devastating. My own family, people who had known me my entire life, thought I was either delusional or deliberately exaggerating my professional responsibilities. The conversation moved on quickly, but the damage was done. I had been publicly dismissed as someone living in a fantasy world, and nobody had defended me. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my relationship with my family. I stopped trying to explain my work altogether. If they couldn't respect what I did for a living, I wouldn't waste energy seeking their approval or understanding. This withdrawal created an even wider gap between us. Family dinners became tense. Affairs where I answered questions about my job with vague responses and changed subjects as quickly as possible. My parents interpreted my reticence as confirmation that my work wasn't as important as I claimed. If she really had such a significant career, my mother would say to Kevin when she thought I couldn't hear, she wouldn't be so secretive about the details. The irony was that my career was accelerating rapidly during this period of family skepticism. My work on a major infrastructure protection project had caught the attention of senior officials at the Department of Homeland Security. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was invited to present our findings at a classified briefing, attended by representatives from multiple federal agencies, an honor typically reserved for analysts with decades more experience than I had. But I couldn't share this achievement with anyone in my family. The presentation itself was classified, the attendees were confidential, and even acknowledging that such a meeting had taken place would have violated my security agreements. From my family's perspective, I was just spending more time on mysterious computer work that I refused to discuss in any meaningful detail. The professional recognition continued building throughout my third year at Secure Dynamics. I was assigned to increasingly sensitive projects, earned additional security clearances, and began developing a reputation within the cybersecurity community as someone who could identify threats that others missed. My technical skills were strong, but my real talent lay in understanding how different types of attackers thought and predicting their likely methods and targets. This psychological insight into cybercriminal behavior led to my involvement in some of the most significant threat assessment work our firm had ever undertaken. We were tracking organized groups that posed serious risks to critical national infrastructure, analyzing their capabilities, and developing countermeasures to protect vulnerable systems. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally fulfilling, but it was also isolating in ways that went beyond family misunderstanding. The security requirements meant I couldn't discuss my successes with friends from college, couldn't network openly at industry conferences, and couldn't build the kind of public professional reputation that might have helped validate my career choices to skeptical relatives. Meanwhile, Kevin's success continued to be visible and celebrated by our entire extended family. He opened 2 new restaurant locations, got married in a beautiful ceremony that was extensively photographed and shared across social media, and bought a house in an upscale neighborhood that became a frequent topic of proud conversation among our relatives. The contrast was stark and painful. Kevin's achievements were tangible, public, and easily understood by everyone in our family. My accomplishments were invisible, classified, and impossible to explain in ways that would satisfy people who measured success by conventional external markers. This dynamic reached its peak during last year's Chinese New Year celebration. Our extended family had gathered for the traditional dinner, and the conversation naturally turned to career updates and life milestones. Kevin announced that he was being considered for a significant expansion opportunity that would involve opening restaurants in 3 new states, a development that generated enthusiastic questions and congratulations from everyone present. Wednesday. The attention inevitably turned to me. I found myself in the familiar position of trying to describe my work without violating security protocols or sounding like I was making grandiose claims about my importance. I mentioned that I had recently completed a major project analysis that had been well received by our clients, but I couldn't provide the specifics that would make the achievement meaningful to my audience. My cousin David, who worked in real estate development, pressed for more details with the kind of friendly skepticism that had become typical of family interactions about my career. "Come on, Sarah," he said with an encouraging smile. "You can tell us what you actually accomplished. We're family, right? What's the big secret?" The question hung in the air as everyone waited for my response. I could see the doubt in their expressions, the assumption that my reluctance to provide details meant there weren't any meaningful details to provide. In that moment, I realized that no explanation I could offer would satisfy their skepticism. They had already decided that my career was somehow less real or important than their own more conventional paths. So I gave the response that had become my default. I work on security analysis for various clients, and the specific details are confidential. It's technical work that helps protect computer systems from potential threats. The answer was accurate but deliberately vague, and I could see the familiar eye rolls and knowing looks exchanged around the table. My grandmother, who had always been supportive but clearly didn't understand what I did for a living, tried to bridge the awkwardness by asking if I enjoyed my work. The question was kind, but it highlighted the fundamental disconnect between my family's understanding of careers and the reality of my professional life. I told her honestly that I found the work fascinating and meaningful, that I felt like I was contributing to something important, even if I couldn't explain exactly what that contribution involved. But even as I spoke, I could see the polite smiles and patient nods that indicated people were humoring rather than believing me. The evening continued with more updates from other family members, each sharing achievements and milestones that could be easily understood and celebrated. New jobs with clear titles and obvious responsibilities, home purchases in neighborhoods everyone recognized, children's accomplishments in school activities that grandparents could attend and photograph. By contrast, my professional life remained mysterious and unverifiable. I couldn't bring colleagues to family gatherings because many of them worked under similar security restrictions. I couldn't show off awards or recognition because they often came from agencies that preferred to maintain low public profiles. I couldn't even explain my day-to-day responsibilities in ways that would satisfy people who expected concrete, tangible descriptions of work activities. This pattern of family skepticism continued through several more gatherings over the following months. Each time, I found myself in the same position of trying to defend a career that I couldn't fully explain to people who had already decided it wasn't as legitimate or important as more conventional professional paths. The frustration was compounded by the fact that my work was genuinely significant and increasingly recognized within my field. I had been promoted twice in 3 years, was earning a salary that exceeded many of my college classmates, and was regularly consulted by senior analysts on complex threat assessments. But none of these achievements could be easily communicated to family members who measured career success by external visibility and social recognition. The final straw came 6 months ago during my cousin Michelle's wedding reception. The celebration was elaborate and well-attended, bringing together relatives from both sides of her family, along with friends and colleagues from various professional backgrounds. During the reception dinner, tables were arranged to encourage mingling between different social groups, and I found myself seated with several of Michelle's co-workers and their spouses. The conversation naturally turned to careers and professional backgrounds, with each person sharing what they did for a living and how they had met Michelle. When my turn came, I offered my usual simplified explanation about working in cybersecurity, consulting, focusing on protecting computer systems for various clients. One of Michelle's colleagues, who worked in marketing for a tech startup, showed genuine interest in my field and asked several thoughtful questions about current cybersecurity challenges. The conversation was going well until my Uncle Robert, who had been listening from across the table, decided to contribute his perspective on my career. "Oh, Sarah works for some super-secret government agency," he announced with a laugh that made it clear he didn't believe his own words. At least that's what she claims. None of us have ever figured out what she actually does all day, but it must be pretty important since she can't tell us anything about it. The comment was delivered with the kind of joking tone that made it difficult to object without seeming defensive, but the underlying message was unmistakable. My own uncle was publicly expressing doubt about the legitimacy of my career, suggesting to a table full of strangers that I was either lying or delusional about my professional responsibilities. The marketing professional looked confused and slightly uncomfortable, unsure how to respond to what seemed like a family inside joke with an edge of genuine hostility. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger, but responding defensively would only reinforce the impression that I was being overly sensitive about legitimate questions. Instead, I excused myself from the table and spent the remainder of the reception avoiding conversations about careers or professional topics. The evening that should have been a celebration of my cousin's happiness became another reminder that my own family didn't respect or believe in my chosen path. That night, I made a decision that would reshape my relationship with my extended family. I stopped attending optional gatherings where career discussions were likely to come up. I declined invitations to dinner parties, birthday celebrations, and casual get-togethers where the familiar pattern of skepticism and dismissal would inevitably repeat itself. This withdrawal created its own problems, as my absence was interpreted as confirmation that I was either too proud to face questions about my work or too embarrassed to admit that my career wasn't as important as I claimed. My mother received concerned calls from relatives who worried that I was becoming antisocial or developing an inflated sense of self-importance. The truth was simpler and more painful. I was tired of defending my life choices to people who had already decided not to believe me. If my family couldn't accept that I had built a successful and meaningful career, I would build a life that didn't require their validation or approval. This decision created a noticeable shift in family dynamics. Holiday celebrations became smaller and more strained, with my parents caught between defending my absence to concerned relatives and expressing their own frustration with my increasing distance from family activities. Kevin tried to serve as a mediator, suggesting that I was just going through a difficult phase that would eventually resolve itself. But the phase continued for months, and if anything, the professional demands of my work were increasing rather than decreasing. My security clearances had been upgraded again, allowing me access to even more sensitive intelligence about emerging cyber threats. The projects I was working on had expanded in scope and complexity, involving coordination between multiple federal agencies and requiring expertise that few analysts possessed. Ironically, as my family relationships deteriorated, my professional reputation was reaching new heights. I had been selected to lead a task force analyzing threats to critical infrastructure systems, a responsibility that put me at the center of some of the most important cybersecurity work being conducted anywhere in the country. The task force brought together experts from various agencies and private sector firms, all working under the highest levels of security clearance to assess vulnerabilities that could potentially impact millions of Americans. The work was fascinating and crucial, involving analysis of sophisticated attack methods and development of defensive strategies that would protect everything from power grids to financial networks. But I couldn't share any of this recognition with the people who should have been proudest of my achievements. The task force appointment was classified, the work products were restricted, and even acknowledging my involvement would have violated multiple security protocols. From my family's perspective, I was still just spending long hours on mysterious computer work that I refused to explain. The isolation was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Professional success felt hollow, when there was nobody in my personal life who could understand or celebrate what I had accomplished. I had colleagues who appreciated my work, but the security restrictions limited how much we could discuss even among ourselves outside of official settings. Meanwhile, Kevin's career continued to provide the kind of visible, easily celebrated achievements that our family valued. He was featured in a local business magazine as one of the city's rising young entrepreneurs, an honor that generated proud social media posts from multiple relatives and became a frequent topic of conversation at family gatherings. I no longer attended. The contrast between our situations couldn't have been more stark. Kevin's success was public, photographable, and perfectly suited for social media sharing. My achievements were invisible, classified, and impossible to discuss in any context that would satisfy people hungry for concrete details and verification. This dynamic reached its breaking point 3 months ago when my cousin David announced his engagement and began planning an elaborate celebration that would bring together our entire extended family. The engagement party was scheduled for a weekend when I had planned to attend a classified briefing about emerging threats to financial infrastructure, a meeting that represented months of preparation and analysis. I couldn't attend the engagement party without missing the briefing, and I couldn't miss the briefing without potentially compromising work that had national security implications. But explaining this conflict to my family would have required revealing details about my schedule and responsibilities that I wasn't authorized to discuss. So I simply declined the invitation with a vague explanation about work commitments, a response that generated the predictable eye rolls and skeptical comments about my mysterious and supposedly important responsibilities. My mother called to express disappointment that I was prioritizing my nebulous career over family relationships, a conversation that ended with both of us frustrated and hurt. The engagement party proceeded without me, and based on the photos and stories shared afterward, it was a wonderful celebration that I would have genuinely enjoyed attending under different circumstances. But the conflict it represented, between my professional obligations and family expectations, seemed impossible to resolve as long as my work remained incomprehensible to people who measured careers by external visibility. This ongoing tension was weighing heavily on my mind as I prepared for what would become the most significant assignment of my career. Our task force had identified a sophisticated cybercriminal organization that posed serious threats to multiple, critical infrastructure systems. The group's capabilities and intentions suggested they were planning attacks that could potentially impact millions of people, making their neutralization a top priority for federal law enforcement. My role in the investigation involved analyzing the group's methods and predicting their likely targets, work that required deep technical expertise and psychological insight into how organized cybercriminals operate. The analysis was complex and time-sensitive, involving coordination with multiple agencies and careful protection of intelligence sources that had taken years to develop. As I worked on this project, I found myself thinking about the irony of my situation. I was contributing to work that was genuinely vital for national security, using skills and knowledge that had taken years to develop, and collaborating with some of the most talented professionals in the cybersecurity field. Yet my own family remained convinced that my career was somehow less real or important than more conventional professional paths. The investigation was reaching critical stages when my cousin David's wedding invitation arrived, along with a note from my mother expressing hope that I would prioritize family relationships over work commitments for this important celebration. The wedding was scheduled for a 3-day weekend that coincided with a crucial phase of our cybercriminal investigation, creating another impossible conflict between professional obligations and family expectations. I knew that declining another family celebration would further damage relationships that were already strained to the breaking point. But I also knew that the work I was doing was too important to abandon for social obligations, regardless of how that decision would be perceived by relatives who didn't understand the nature of my responsibilities. The wedding invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks as I wrestled with the decision. Part of me wanted to attend, to rebuild connections with family members, and perhaps find ways to explain my career that would finally satisfy their skepticism. But another part of me recognized that attending would mean compromising work that had genuine national security implications. a sacrifice that felt both professionally irresponsible and personally dishonest. In the end, I chose my professional obligations over family expectations, a decision that I knew would be interpreted as further evidence of my inflated sense of self-importance and disconnection from what really mattered in life. I sent my regrets along with a generous wedding gift, knowing that this absence would likely be remembered and discussed for years to come. The wedding weekend arrived with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I could focus entirely on the critical work that demanded my attention, and sadness that I was missing another opportunity to connect with family members whose approval and understanding I still craved, despite everything that had happened between us. As I worked through that weekend, analyzing threat patterns and preparing briefings for federal agents who would soon take action based on my assessments, I tried to convince myself that I had made the right choice. The work was undeniably important, and my contributions were genuinely valuable for protecting systems that millions of people depended on without ever thinking about. But the personal cost was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. I was succeeding professionally in ways that exceeded my wildest expectations when I first started my career, yet I felt more isolated and misunderstood than ever before. The security requirements that protected national interests also protected my family from ever truly understanding what I had accomplished or why it mattered. This isolation was about to reach its conclusion in ways that none of us could have anticipated. The cybercriminal investigation was moving toward its final phases, and my analysis had identified patterns that would soon lead federal agents directly to the suspects we had been tracking for months. Within days, the theoretical threat assessments I had been working on would translate into real-world law enforcement action. What I didn't know was that this transition from analysis to action would finally provide the validation and recognition that had been missing from my family relationships for the past 3 years. The invisible work that had seemed so mysterious and unverifiable to my relatives was about to become very visible indeed, in ways that would transform how they understood both my career and my value as a professional. The stage was set for a confrontation between the secret world of my professional life and the skeptical assumptions of my family relationships. Soon, the people who had questioned whether my work was real would have their doubts answered by federal agents who understood exactly how real and important my contributions had been. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in March when I discovered the digital signature that would change everything. I had been analyzing traffic patterns across multiple network nodes for 6 weeks, looking for anomalies that might indicate coordinated attack preparation. Most days yielded fragments of information, tiny pieces of a puzzle that seemed impossibly complex and scattered across dozens of different systems. But that Tuesday, something clicked into place. A series of reconnaissance activities that had appeared unrelated suddenly formed a pattern when viewed through the lens of infrastructure vulnerability mapping. The cybercriminal organization we had been tracking wasn't just probing random targets for weaknesses. They were systematically identifying critical points in the Pacific Northwest power grid, specifically targeting backup systems and failover mechanisms that would be crucial during emergency situations. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't opportunistic cybercrime aimed at financial gain or data theft. This was preparation for an attack that could potentially leave millions of people without electricity during the region's peak summer demand period. The scope and sophistication required indicated we were dealing with a group that had significant resources, advanced technical capabilities, and detailed knowledge of how critical infrastructure systems operated. I spent the next 18 hours documenting my findings, cross-referencing the attack patterns with known vulnerabilities, and developing threat assessment models that painted an increasingly alarming picture. The group had spent months mapping target systems with a level of precision that suggested inside knowledge or extensive surveillance capabilities. They had identified exactly which components to target for maximum disruption while minimizing their own exposure to detection and capture. My hands shook as I compiled the final report, knowing that what I had discovered would trigger immediate action from federal law enforcement agencies. This wasn't theoretical anymore. We had identified an active, ongoing threat to infrastructure, systems that served nearly 4 million people across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The attack timeline suggested they were planning to strike within the next few weeks, possibly targeting the period when summer cooling demands would make power grid stability most vulnerable. The classified briefing I requested for Thursday morning brought together representatives from the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, regional power grid operators, and senior analysts from 3 different cybersecurity firms. I had never presented to such a high-level audience, and the weight of responsibility felt crushing as I prepared to explain how months of analysis had led to this moment of crisis. Agent Maria Rodriguez from the FBI's Cybercrime Division took the lead in questioning my findings, probing every assumption and methodology with the kind of intense scrutiny that made me grateful for the thoroughness of my documentation. She wanted to understand not just what I had discovered, but how confident I was in the accuracy of my threat assessments and the reliability of my predictive models. The questions continued for over 3 hours as experts from different agencies examined my work from every possible angle. They challenged my interpretations, tested alternative explanations, and demanded levels of certainty that pushed me to defend conclusions I had spent weeks developing. By the end of the session, I was exhausted but confident that my analysis would withstand the intense scrutiny that major law enforcement operations required. Agent Rodriguez pulled me aside after the formal briefing concluded, her expression serious but respectful, in a way that made me realize how much the dynamic had shifted since I first started trying to explain my work to skeptical audiences. "Sarah," she said, looking directly into my eyes, "this is exceptional work. The level of detail and accuracy in your threat modeling is exactly what we need to prevent what could have been a catastrophic attack." She explained that my analysis had provided law enforcement with the specific information needed to identify and locate the cybercriminal organization before they could execute their planned infrastructure attacks. The FBI would be coordinating with multiple agencies to conduct simultaneous raids across several states, targeting individuals whose activities I had helped trace through months of digital forensic work. The timeline for law enforcement action was accelerated based on my findings. Rather than waiting for additional intelligence gathering, the agencies involved agreed that the threat level justified immediate intervention. My analysis indicated that the group was in final preparation stages, meaning any delay could allow them to launch attacks that would be extremely difficult to stop once initiated. What this meant for my personal life became clear when Agent Rodriguez explained the security protocols that would govern the next phase of the investigation. As the analyst whose work had identified and tracked the criminal organization, I would need to be available for immediate consultation during the arrest operations. The raids would likely take place over a weekend when key suspects would be most likely to be at their primary residences. More significantly for my family situation, the arrests would almost certainly generate media attention that could expose my role in the investigation. While specific details of my analysis would remain classified, the fact that a cybersecurity consultant had provided crucial intelligence for a major federal operation would likely become public knowledge through court filings and press releases. Agent Rodriguez asked whether I had concerns about this exposure, whether there were personal or professional relationships that might be affected by having my work suddenly become visible in ways it never had before. I found myself thinking about my family, about 3 years of skeptical questions and dismissive comments about my mysterious career that nobody could understand or verify. I told her honestly that the exposure might actually solve some long-standing personal problems, though I wasn't sure my relatives were prepared to learn just how wrong they had been about the legitimacy and importance of my work. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of being unable to prove what I did for a living, federal agents were about to provide more validation than I had ever imagined possible. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I worked closely with FBI technical specialists to refine target identification, and ensure that law enforcement teams had the most current intelligence about suspect locations and activities. My phone remained constantly available for consultation, and I carried encrypted communication devices that would allow real-time coordination during the actual arrest operations. Meanwhile, my family continued to exist in their familiar world of conventional careers and easily understood professional achievements. Kevin called twice during that week to share news about restaurant expansion plans and to ask whether I might be able to attend our cousin Rachel's graduation party the following month. The contrast between his normal concerns and the federal law enforcement operation I was helping coordinate felt surreal and somehow profound. I found myself wondering how my parents would react when they discovered what I had actually been doing. During all those long hours, they assumed I spent playing computer games or exaggerating my professional importance. Would they understand that the secrecy they had interpreted as evasiveness was actually a legal requirement that protected ongoing investigations? Would they recognize that my inability to explain my work in simple terms reflected the genuine complexity of cybersecurity threats, rather than an attempt to seem more important than I really was? Thursday evening brought an unexpected call from my mother, who wanted to discuss holiday planning and family vacation possibilities for the upcoming summer. She spoke about Kevin's success with the restaurant business and expressed hope that I might be able to take time away from my computer, work to spend more quality time with relatives who missed seeing me at family gatherings. The conversation felt like it was happening in an alternate universe. While my mother worried about my social isolation and questioned whether my career priorities were properly balanced, I was coordinating with federal agents about an operation that would likely prevent cyber attacks capable of disrupting power supplies for millions of people. The disconnect was so extreme it was almost comedic, except that it represented 3 years of accumulated frustration and misunderstanding. I managed to end the call without revealing anything about the pending law enforcement operation, but the conversation left me feeling more isolated than ever. Here I was, on the verge of the most significant professional achievement of my career, working on something that would genuinely protect public safety and national security. And I still couldn't share any of it with the people whose approval and understanding I had sought for so long. Friday brought final preparations and confirmation that the raids would take place over the weekend. Agent Rodriguez called to review my availability and ensure that I understood the communication protocols that would allow real-time consultation during the arrests. She also warned me that media attention would likely begin within hours of the operation, meaning my role in the investigation would soon become publicly known in ways that would permanently change how people understood my career. The weight of that realization was both exciting and terrifying. After years of having my work dismissed as mysterious or unimportant, I was about to have its significance validated in the most public way possible. Federal agents would be acting on my analysis, arresting dangerous criminals based on intelligence I had developed, and protecting critical infrastructure because of threats I had identified and characterized. But this validation would also expose the extent to which my family had misjudged and dismissed my professional accomplishments. The revelation that their computer-obsessed daughter had been working on genuine national security issues would force them to confront 3 years of skepticism and casual dismissal of work they had never bothered to understand. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that seemed to match my mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the day ahead. I had been awake since 4 a.m., reviewing final intelligence reports and ensuring that all communication systems were functioning properly for the coordinated law enforcement operation that would begin in just a few hours. The first arrests were scheduled to begin at 6 a.m. Pacific Time, with simultaneous raids in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, targeting the core members of the cybercriminal organization my analysis had identified. Additional operations would follow throughout the day as law enforcement teams worked through the complete list of suspects and accomplices whose activities I had helped trace over months of painstaking digital investigation. My role during the actual arrests would be to provide real-time analysis of any digital evidence discovered during the raids, helping agents understand the significance of computer systems, data storage devices, and network configurations they encountered at suspect locations. This work required me to remain constantly available by secure communication channels, ready to interpret technical findings that could affect the success of ongoing operations. The first call came at 6:15 a.m. from Agent Rodriguez, who reported that the primary target in Seattle had been successfully apprehended along with several associates. The suspects had been found in possession of detailed infrastructure maps, attack planning documents, and sophisticated hacking tools that confirmed the accuracy of my threat assessments. More importantly, they had been captured before executing any of the attacks that could have caused widespread power outages. Similar reports followed throughout the morning, as raids in other cities yielded additional arrests and evidence that painted a complete picture of the criminal organization's capabilities and intentions. My analysis had not only identified the right targets, but had also accurately predicted their operational methods and timing. The law enforcement operation was succeeding beyond expectations, with no major complications or escaped suspects. By noon, Agent Rodriguez was able to confirm that all primary targets had been arrested, and that evidence collected during the raids would likely support prosecution for conspiracy to commit cyber-terrorism, among other serious federal charges. The threat to critical infrastructure had been neutralized before any attacks could be launched, and the sophisticated criminal organization had been completely dismantled through coordinated law enforcement action. The success of the operation generated immediate attention from senior officials at multiple federal agencies. I received calls throughout the afternoon from supervisors expressing gratitude for work that had prevented what could have been catastrophic attacks on systems that millions of people depended on for essential services. The recognition was professionally gratifying in ways I had never experienced before. More significantly for my personal situation, Agent Rodriguez confirmed that media attention was already beginning to focus on the cybersecurity analysis that had made the arrests possible. While specific details of my methods and findings would remain classified, the fact that a private sector consultant had provided crucial intelligence for a major federal operation would likely become public knowledge within days. She asked again whether I had any concerns about this exposure, particularly regarding personal relationships that might be affected by having my professional work suddenly become visible and validated in such a public way. I told her honestly that I was looking forward to finally having concrete proof of what I did for a living, even if that proof might create some awkward conversations with family members who had spent years questioning the legitimacy of my career. Sunday brought the first news reports about the arrests, initially focused on the basic facts of the law enforcement operation without much detail about the investigative work that had made it possible. But by Monday morning, journalists had begun digging deeper into the story, and my name started appearing in articles about the cybersecurity analysis that had identified and tracked the criminal organization. The first call from a family member came Monday afternoon from my cousin David, who had seen a news report mentioning my role in the federal investigation. His tone was completely different from any conversation we had ever had about my career. Filled with surprise and genuine respect for work he was finally beginning to understand was both real and significant. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and embarrassment, "I had no idea you were working on anything like this. The news report said your analysis was crucial for preventing attacks that could have affected millions of people. Is that really what you've been doing all this time when we thought you were just playing around with computers?" The question that had taken him years to ask seriously was finally being posed with the kind of respect and genuine curiosity that I had always hoped for from my family. I explained that the federal investigation was indeed representative of the type of work I had been doing for the past 3 years, though most of it remained classified and couldn't be discussed in detail even now that some aspects had become public. David listened with growing amazement as I described the general nature of cybersecurity threat analysis, the months of work required to track sophisticated criminal organizations, and the coordination with federal agencies that had characterized much of my recent professional life. The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end, He was apologizing for years of skeptical comments and dismissive assumptions about work he had never bothered to understand. Similar calls followed throughout the week as news coverage expanded, and more family members learned about my role in the federal investigation. My uncle Robert, who had publicly questioned the legitimacy of my career at multiple family gatherings, called to express both amazement and embarrassment about how wrong he had been about my professional accomplishments. The conversation with my parents came Tuesday evening, initiated by my mother, who had spent the day fielding phone calls from relatives who had seen news reports about my work. Her voice carried a complex mixture of pride, confusion, and regret, as she tried to process the disconnect between their assumptions about my career and the reality of what I had actually been accomplishing. "Sarah," she began hesitantly, "your father and I have been reading about this federal investigation, and we're trying to understand how long you've been involved in this type of work. The news reports make it sound like you've been doing very important things for the government, but we never realized that your job was anything like what they're describing." I explained patiently that the federal investigation was indeed representative of my normal work responsibilities, though most projects remained classified and couldn't be discussed even with family members. The secrecy they had interpreted as evasiveness or exaggeration was actually a legal requirement that protected ongoing investigations and national security interests. My father took the phone and spoke with a level of respect and genuine interest that I had never heard from him regarding my career. He asked detailed questions about cybersecurity work, about the training and expertise required to identify threats to critical infrastructure, and about the coordination with federal agencies that had characterized my professional life for the past several years. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours as my parents gradually came to understand that their computer-obsessed daughter had been working on genuinely important national security issues rather than the mysterious and probably exaggerated responsibilities they had assumed. The recognition was gratifying, but it also highlighted how completely they had misjudged my professional accomplishments for years. Kevin called Wednesday morning with a level of enthusiasm and brotherly pride that felt completely new in our relationship. He had always been supportive in general terms, but his understanding of my work had been limited by the same security restrictions that had frustrated our parents. Now that some aspects of my professional life had become publicly visible, he could finally appreciate the significance of what I had been doing during all those mysterious work commitments. The validation was overwhelming and transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. After 3 years of being unable to prove the importance of my work to skeptical family members, I suddenly had more recognition and respect than I knew how to handle. Federal agents were publicly crediting my analysis with preventing serious attacks on critical infrastructure, and my family was finally beginning to understand that my career was both legitimate and genuinely significant. But the recognition also brought unexpected complications. Media attention continued to focus on the cybersecurity analysis that had made the arrests possible, and journalists began seeking interviews about my work and expertise in threat identification. While I couldn't discuss classified details, the general interest in my professional background was both flattering and overwhelming for someone who had spent years working in relative anonymity. More challenging was navigating the sudden shift in family dynamics. Relatives who had dismissed my career for years were now eager to ask questions and express belated appreciation for work they had never bothered to understand. The respect was genuine and welcome, but it also highlighted how quick they had been to judge and dismiss something they didn't immediately comprehend. The week culminated with an unexpected visit from Agent Rodriguez, who came to my apartment Thursday evening to discuss ongoing aspects of the federal investigation and to check on how I was handling the sudden public attention. She had become something of a mentor during our work together, and her perspective on the media coverage was both reassuring and insightful. "Sarah," she said as we sat in my living room drinking coffee, "you need to understand that what you accomplished with this analysis is genuinely exceptional. Most cybersecurity professionals never have the opportunity to work on threats of this magnitude. and fewer still have the analytical skills to identify patterns that lead to successful law enforcement operations. She explained that my work had not only prevented serious attacks on critical infrastructure, but had also provided a model for future threat identification that would benefit cybersecurity professionals across multiple agencies. The methods I had developed for tracking sophisticated criminal organizations were already being incorporated into training programs and analytical protocols that would enhance national security capabilities for years to come. The recognition, from someone whose professional judgment I respected deeply, was more meaningful than any family validation could have been. Agent Rodriguez understood exactly what my work involved and could appreciate the technical and analytical skills required to achieve the results that had led to the successful arrests. Her respect was based on professional expertise rather than media coverage or public attention. But she also understood the personal dimensions of my situation, the years of family skepticism that had been suddenly replaced by recognition and respect. She warned me that this kind of dramatic validation could be as challenging to navigate as the original dismissal had been, creating new expectations and pressures that might be difficult to manage. The investigation continued to generate media attention throughout the following week, with additional details emerging about the scope and sophistication of the criminal organization that had been dismantled. My role in the analytical work that had made the arrests possible was consistently highlighted in news coverage, bringing a level of professional recognition that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. This recognition extended beyond my immediate family to the broader professional community I had been part of for years. Colleagues at Secure Dynamics Solutions who had known about my federal consulting work but couldn't discuss it openly were finally able to acknowledge the significance of projects I had been involved in. The validation felt both gratifying and slightly surreal after years of working in relative anonymity. More importantly, the success of the federal investigation had opened doors to new opportunities and responsibilities that would shape the next phase of my career. Agent Rodriguez mentioned that several agencies were interested in expanding their cybersecurity consulting relationships, particularly with analysts who had demonstrated the ability to identify and track sophisticated threats to critical infrastructure. These opportunities represented exactly the kind of career advancement I had been working toward for years, combining technical expertise with meaningful public service in ways that would make full use of my analytical skills and security clearances. The work would remain largely classified and invisible to most outside observers, but it would also provide the professional satisfaction and recognition I had always sought. The only remaining challenge was managing my relationship with family members who were still processing how wrong they had been about my professional life. The sudden shift from skepticism to respect was welcome, but also somewhat overwhelming, creating new dynamics that would require careful navigation in the months ahead. My cousin Rachel's graduation party was coming up in 2 weeks, representing the first family gathering since news of my role in the federal investigation had become public. I was curious to see how the dynamics would play out now that questions about the legitimacy and importance of my career had been definitively answered by federal agents and national media coverage. The anticipation was both exciting and slightly nerve-wracking. After years of declining family invitations, because I couldn't bear another round of skeptical questions about my mysterious career, I would finally be attending a celebration where my professional accomplishments were understood and respected. The validation was everything I had hoped for, even if it had come in ways I never could have anticipated. As I prepared for what would certainly be an interesting family gathering, I reflected on how dramatically my situation had changed in just 2 weeks. The invisible work that had seemed so mysterious and unverifiable to my relatives had become the most public and validated aspect of my professional life. Federal agents had provided more proof of my career's importance than I had ever imagined possible. The question now was how to move forward with family relationships that had been fundamentally transformed by this sudden exposure of what my work actually involved. The respect was welcome, but it also highlighted how quick my relatives had been to dismiss something they didn't understand. The recognition felt good, but it also raised questions about how much their approval should matter to my sense of professional and personal worth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was no longer the family member with the mysterious and questionably important career. The federal investigation had provided definitive proof that my work was both real and significant, answering 3 years of skeptical questions in the most dramatic way possible. Now I just had to figure out how to navigate relationships that had been completely redefined by this unexpected validation. Rachel's graduation party was everything I had expected and more. The celebration was held at my Aunt Susan's house in Bellevue, with its manicured gardens and panoramic view of Lake Washington. Extended family had driven in from across the state, creating the kind of large gathering that had always made me anxious about inevitable career discussions and subtle comparisons between my mysterious work and Kevin's visible success in the restaurant business. But this time felt fundamentally different. Instead of preparing defensive responses to skeptical questions about my computer work, I found myself fielding genuine inquiries about cybersecurity and federal investigations. Relatives who had spent years treating my career as an elaborate fantasy were now asking respectful questions about threat analysis and national security work. My cousin Michelle approached me within minutes of arriving, her expression carrying a mixture of excitement and embarrassment that had become familiar over the past few weeks. "Sarah," she said, gripping my arm with enthusiasm, "I cannot believe. I'm related to someone who helped the FBI catch actual terrorists. My friends have been asking me a million questions about what you do, and I finally have real answers instead of just saying you work with computers." The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion I had ever had with family members about my professional life. Michelle wanted to understand how threat analysis actually worked, how I had learned to identify patterns in cybercriminal behavior, and what it felt like to know that my work had prevented attacks that could have affected millions of people. Her questions were informed and thoughtful, clearly based on research she had done after seeing news coverage about the federal investigation. Similar interactions continued throughout the afternoon as relatives approached with curiosity rather than skepticism, respect rather than dismissal. My uncle Robert, who had publicly questioned the legitimacy of my career at multiple family gatherings, spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about cybersecurity consulting and expressing genuine amazement at the scope and importance of the work I had been doing. The conversation with Robert was particularly satisfying because of how completely it reversed our previous dynamic. Instead of defending vague descriptions of mysterious computer work, I found myself explaining real aspects of threat identification and federal coordination that demonstrated both the legitimacy and significance of my professional responsibilities. He listened with the kind of engaged attention that I had always hoped for, but never received when discussing my career. Kevin noticed the transformation in family dynamics and pulled me aside during a quiet moment on the back patio. "This is incredible, Sarah," he said with genuine brotherly pride. "Everyone is talking about how impressive your work is, how they never realized what you were actually doing all these years. I have to admit, I didn't really understand it either, but seeing how people react when they find out what cybersecurity analysis actually involves, it's obvious that you've been doing something really important." His acknowledgement meant more to me than any of the other recognition, because Kevin had always been supportive in general terms, even when he didn't understand the specifics of my work. Having him finally appreciate the significance of my professional accomplishments felt like validation from the family member whose opinion mattered most to me personally. The afternoon continued with conversations that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Instead of awkward deflections and skeptical comments about my mysterious career, family members wanted to hear about cybersecurity challenges, federal coordination processes, and the analytical methods that had led to successful law enforcement operations. The respect was genuine and enthusiastic, creating the kind of professional recognition I had always hoped to receive from people whose approval I valued. But the most meaningful interaction came from my grandmother, who approached me as I was helping serve dessert in the kitchen. "Sarah, dear," she said in her gentle voice, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. I never understood what you did for work, but I could always tell it was important to you. And that was enough for me. Now that I know you, we're helping protect people from dangerous criminals. I'm even more proud of the woman you've become." Her words brought tears to my eyes because they acknowledged both my professional achievements and the personal cost of years spent working in isolation and secrecy. My grandmother had never questioned the legitimacy of my career, but she had also never had concrete evidence of its importance until federal agents and media coverage provided validation that satisfied even the most skeptical family members. The party was winding down when my phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Rodriguez asking if I could be available for a consultation call the following morning. Additional evidence had been discovered during the ongoing investigation, and my expertise was needed to analyze materials that might reveal connections to other cybercriminal organizations or planned attacks. The message served as a reminder that while my family was celebrating my role in the completed federal operation, my actual work continued with new threats and ongoing investigations that required the same analytical skills and security clearances that had made the recent arrests possible. The recognition was gratifying, but the responsibilities were ongoing and demanded continued professional excellence. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically the family dynamics had shifted in just a few weeks. The invisible work that had seemed so mysterious and questionable to my relatives had become a source of pride and genuine interest, generating conversations that demonstrated respect for both my technical expertise and my contribution to public safety. But I also recognized that this transformation raised complex questions about the nature of family support and professional validation. The same relatives who had dismissed my career for years were now eager to claim association with my success, expressing pride in accomplishments they had previously questioned or ignored. The recognition felt good, but it also highlighted how conditional their respect had always been. The consultation call with Agent Rodriguez the next morning brought news that would further complicate my relationship with newfound family recognition. The arrested cybercriminals had been part of a larger network with international connections, and evidence discovered during the raids suggested additional threats that required immediate investigation. My analytical expertise was needed for an expanded federal operation that would involve multiple agencies and potentially months of additional classified work. This development meant that my recent media visibility had been only a brief glimpse into work that would continue to be largely invisible and impossible to discuss in detail. While my family now understood that my career was legitimate and important, most of my future accomplishments would remain just as mysterious and unverifiable as they had been before the arrests provided temporary public validation. Agent Rodriguez explained that the expanded investigation would require enhanced security clearances and even stricter communication protocols than I had previously operated under. The success of the recent operation had identified me as someone with exceptional analytical capabilities, but it had also made me a more valuable target for criminal organizations that might want to neutralize threats to their operations. The security considerations were sobering but not entirely surprising. Working on high-level federal investigations inevitably carried risks that went beyond professional responsibilities, affecting personal safety and family relationships in ways that most careers never involved. The protection protocols would add another layer of complexity to relationships that were just beginning to recover from years of misunderstanding and skepticism. More immediately challenging was the timing of the expanded investigation, which would conflict with several family commitments that I had finally felt comfortable making after years of declining invitations. My cousin David's wedding was scheduled for the following month, and I had already confirmed my attendance after missing too many family celebrations due to work obligations that nobody understood or respected. The wedding represented an opportunity to continue rebuilding family relationships that had been damaged by years of professional secrecy and mutual misunderstanding. But accepting the expanded federal consulting role would likely require missing another important family gathering, creating new tensions just as old ones were beginning to resolve. I discussed the dilemma with Agent Rodriguez, who understood both the professional importance of the investigation and the personal significance of family relationships that had been strained by security requirements. She acknowledged that cybersecurity professionals often faced impossible choices between career obligations and personal commitments, particularly when their work involved national security considerations that couldn't be explained or justified to skeptical relatives. The conversation helped clarify that while recent media attention had resolved questions about the legitimacy of my career, it hadn't eliminated the fundamental tensions between security requirements and family expectations. My relatives now respected my work, but they still didn't understand why it had to be so secretive, or why it required sacrificing social commitments for professional obligations. After much consideration, I decided to accept the expanded consulting role while trying to minimize its impact on family relationships that were just beginning to heal. I would attend David's wedding, but would need to leave early for work commitments that I couldn't explain in detail, creating a compromise that satisfied neither my professional responsibilities nor my family obligations. The decision reflected ongoing challenges that success in the cybersecurity field seemed to create, rather than resolve. Recognition for my analytical capabilities led to more sensitive assignments that required greater secrecy and more demanding security protocols. Professional advancement came at the cost of personal relationships that were difficult to maintain when most of my work remained classified and incomprehensible to people outside the field. David's wedding weekend arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had become characteristic of family gatherings since my role in the federal investigation had become public knowledge. The celebration would be the largest family gathering since news coverage had transformed how relatives understood my professional life, creating an opportunity to continue rebuilding relationships while navigating new expectations about my career. Significance. The rehearsal dinner on Friday evening demonstrated how completely the family dynamics had shifted since my last appearance at a major celebration. Instead of polite tolerance for my mysterious computer work, I found myself fielding eager questions about cybersecurity consulting and federal investigations. Relatives wanted to understand threat analysis methodologies, security clearance processes, and coordination protocols with federal agencies. The attention was flattering, but also somewhat overwhelming for someone who had spent years working in relative anonymity. Uncle Robert introduced me to other wedding guests as his niece who had helped the FBI catch dangerous cybercriminals, a description that generated immediate interest and respect from people who had never heard of me before but were impressed by the federal law enforcement connection. Saturday morning brought the wedding ceremony itself, held in a beautiful botanical garden that provided the perfect setting for David's marriage to his longtime girlfriend, Amanda. The service was traditional and meaningful, bringing together families and friends in celebration of a relationship that had developed over several years of shared experiences and mutual support. During the ceremony, I found myself thinking about the nature of relationships and recognition, about how my own professional achievements had finally received the family validation I had always sought, but had learned to live without. The wedding represented everything that conventional success looked like: visible accomplishments that could be easily understood and celebrated by people who measured achievement through external markers. My work would always be more complicated, requiring explanation and justification to people who expected careers to be comprehensible and verifiable through public recognition. The recent federal investigation had provided temporary visibility, but most of my future accomplishments would remain just as mysterious and classified as they had been before media coverage forced my family to acknowledge what I actually did for a living. The reception that followed was elegant and well-orchestrated, bringing together David's extended family with Amanda's relatives and their college friends in a celebration that demonstrated the social connections and community recognition that characterized conventional professional success. The couple had built a life that made sense to everyone who knew them, avoiding the complications and isolation that seemed inherent in cybersecurity work. I enjoyed the celebration while mentally preparing for the early departure that work obligations would require. The expanded federal investigation demanded my participation in a classified briefing scheduled for Sunday morning. meaning I would need to leave the reception by 10 p.m. to ensure adequate rest before engaging with material that required complete mental clarity and analytical precision. The departure logistics created exactly the kind of awkward situation that had characterized my family relationships for years. While other relatives could enjoy the complete celebration, I would need to excuse myself early for work commitments that I couldn't explain in detail, even though everyone now understood that my career was legitimate and important. Kevin noticed my early preparation to leave and asked whether I was feeling well or if something urgent had come up at work. I explained that I had consulting commitments the following morning that required early preparation, a description that was accurate but necessarily vague about the specific nature of federal coordination requirements and security protocols. His expression showed understanding mixed with concern about the demands that my career seemed to place on personal relationships. "I can see why this job is hard on family stuff," he said thoughtfully. "Even now that we know how important your work is, it still requires you to miss parts of celebrations for reasons you can't explain. That must be really difficult to balance." His insight was both perceptive and touching, acknowledging the inherent tensions between security requirements and family relationships that recognition couldn't entirely resolve. While my relatives now respected my professional accomplishments, they were also beginning to understand why cybersecurity consulting created ongoing challenges for personal connections and social commitments. The conversation was interrupted by my phone vibrating with an encrypted message from Agent Rodriguez, confirming the Sunday morning briefing location and providing additional security protocols for accessing classified materials. The message served as a concrete reminder that my work continued regardless of social celebrations, demanding immediate attention whenever national security considerations required consultation or analysis. I said my goodbyes to family members who expressed understanding about work obligations, while also conveying disappointment that I couldn't stay for the complete celebration. The reactions were respectful and supportive, demonstrating how much the family dynamics had improved since my career had received public validation through federal law enforcement recognition. But the early departure also highlighted ongoing tensions that success seemed to intensify rather than resolve. Recognition for my analytical capabilities led to more demanding assignments that required greater sacrifices of personal time and social commitments. Professional advancement came at the cost of relationships that were difficult to maintain when work obligations remained largely invisible and impossible to explain in satisfying detail. Driving home Saturday night, I reflected on how the recent transformation in family understanding had been both gratifying and complicated. The respect was genuine and welcome, but it had also created new expectations about my career significance that might be difficult to sustain as media attention faded and my work returned to its characteristic secrecy and anonymity. The Sunday morning briefing brought news that would test these new family dynamics in ways I hadn't anticipated. The expanded investigation had uncovered evidence of an imminent threat that required immediate action from multiple federal agencies, creating an emergency situation that would demand my complete availability for the next several weeks, regardless of personal commitments or family expectations. Agent Rodriguez explained that the cybercriminal network we had been tracking had connections to international organizations that posed serious threats to critical infrastructure across multiple regions. The scope and complexity of the threat required the most experienced analysts available, and my previous success had identified me as someone whose expertise was crucial for preventing potential attacks that could affect millions of people. The assignment would require temporary relocation to a classified facility where I would work alongside experts from various agencies in a coordinated effort to identify and neutralize threats before they could be implemented. The work would be completely classified and would prevent any communication with family members beyond basic confirmation that I was safe and engaged in important professional responsibilities. This development represented exactly the kind of career opportunity that cybersecurity professionals spend years working toward, involving cutting-edge threat analysis and direct coordination with the highest levels of federal law enforcement. But it also meant returning to the isolation and secrecy that had characterized my work before recent media attention provided temporary visibility and family recognition. The irony was profound and somewhat depressing. Just as my family had finally understood and respected my professional accomplishments, my career was advancing in directions that would make it even more invisible and impossible to discuss than it had been during the years of skepticism and dismissal. I accepted the assignment while recognizing that it would likely restart the cycle of family misunderstanding and frustration that had only recently been resolved through federal law enforcement. Validation. My relatives now knew that my work was legitimate and important, but they would once again be unable to understand or verify what I was actually doing during long absences for classified responsibilities. The temporary facility was located outside Washington, D.C., requiring immediate travel and extended residence away from my normal life and relationships. The work would be intensive and demanding, involving coordination with intelligence analysts, federal agents, and cybersecurity experts from across the government in a concentrated effort to neutralize serious threats to national security. This assignment represented the culmination of everything I had been working towards since starting my career in cybersecurity, combining technical expertise with meaningful public service in ways that would make full use of my analytical capabilities and security clearances. But it also meant returning to the professional isolation that had made family relationships so difficult to maintain. As I prepared for departure, I called my parents to explain that I would be unavailable for several weeks due to work commitments that I couldn't discuss in detail. The conversation was strained but respectful, with both of them expressing understanding about professional obligations while also conveying disappointment about renewed secrecy and unavailability. My mother asked whether this assignment was similar to the federal investigation that had received media attention, and I confirmed that it involved the same type of cybersecurity analysis, but with enhanced security requirements that prevented any public discussion or recognition. The explanation seemed to satisfy her curiosity, while also preparing her for a return to the mystery and isolation that had characterized my career before recent visibility. The assignment would last at least 6 weeks, potentially longer depending on the complexity of threats discovered and the success of neutralization efforts. During that time, I would be essentially invisible to my family and friends, working under security protocols that prevented normal communication and social interaction. But I was also excited about the opportunity to contribute to work that genuinely mattered for national security, using skills and expertise that had taken years to develop in service of protecting critical infrastructure and public safety. Professional satisfaction would be immense, even if the personal costs were significant and ongoing. As I boarded the flight to Washington, D.C., I thought about how dramatically my situation had changed over the past few months, while also remaining fundamentally the same. My family now respected my career, but they still couldn't understand or support the demands it placed on personal relationships. Recognition had been gratifying, but advancement required even greater sacrifices of visibility and connection. The cycle seemed destined to continue as long as I remained in cybersecurity consulting, alternating between periods of mysterious unavailability and occasional moments of dramatic validation when classified work became publicly visible through media coverage or federal recognition. My relatives would always struggle to understand a career that operated largely in secret, while occasionally producing results that demonstrated its genuine importance. But I had also learned that professional satisfaction didn't require family approval or public recognition. That meaningful work could be rewarding even when it remained invisible to most outside observers. The respect was nice when it came, but the work itself provided enough validation to sustain motivation and commitment, regardless of whether anyone else understood or appreciated what I was accomplishing. The plane lifted off toward Washington, and the next phase of my career, carrying me away from family relationships that had been recently repaired but would soon be tested again by the demands of classified work and security requirements. The pattern would likely continue indefinitely. creating ongoing tensions between professional obligations and personal connections that seemed inherent to cybersecurity consulting at the highest levels. But I was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in my abilities and committed to work that genuinely mattered for national security and public safety. The family recognition had been gratifying, but the work itself was the real reward, providing opportunities to contribute to something larger than personal success or social validation. 6 months later, I stood in my new apartment in Arlington, Virginia, unpacking boxes that contained the remnants of my old life in Seattle. The classified facility assignment had extended far beyond the original timeline, evolving into a permanent position with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The work was everything I had dreamed of when I first entered the field, challenging and meaningful in ways that validated every sacrifice I had made along the way. The transition had been surprisingly smooth from a professional standpoint. My colleagues understood the demands of classified work and the isolation it could create from normal social relationships. Here, secrecy wasn't seen as evasiveness, but as professional responsibility. The culture valued expertise over explanation, results over recognition. My family had struggled more with the adjustment. The initial pride and excitement about my federal law enforcement recognition had gradually given way to familiar frustrations about my unavailability and inability to share details about my daily responsibilities. The difference now was that they no longer questioned the legitimacy of my work, only its impact on our relationships. Kevin had visited twice during my transition period, making the cross-country trip to see my new life and understand how dramatically my circumstances had changed. Walking through the secure government facilities where I now worked daily, he finally grasped the scope and importance of cybersecurity infrastructure in ways that abstract explanations had never conveyed. The conversations during his visits had been some of the most honest we'd ever shared about careers, family expectations, and the different paths we had chosen. He acknowledged that while his restaurant success was more visible and socially celebrated, my work had implications that extended far beyond our immediate community. The recognition meant everything coming from the brother whose approval I had always valued most. My parents had adapted more slowly, but with genuine effort. They now understood that my career involved legitimate national security responsibilities, even if they couldn't comprehend the technical details or daily activities. More importantly, they had stopped treating my work as a mysterious hobby that interfered with family obligations and started respecting it as a serious professional commitment. The Christmas gathering had been a turning point in our family dynamics. Instead of the familiar pattern of defensive explanations about vague computer work, I found myself fielding respectful questions about cybersecurity challenges and federal coordination processes. My grandmother had proudly introduced me to her friends as her granddaughter, who worked for the government protecting important computer systems. But the most meaningful change had been in my relationship with extended family members, who had spent years dismissing my career as elaborate fantasy. Uncle Robert had become one of my strongest supporters, regularly sharing news articles about cybersecurity threats with commentary about how important my type of work was for protecting critical infrastructure. The validation had been gratifying, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about the nature of recognition and professional satisfaction. The years of family skepticism had forced me to develop internal motivation and confidence that didn't depend on external approval. When recognition finally came, it felt good, but not essential in ways it might have during earlier stages of my career. My work now involved threats and responsibilities that dwarfed anything I had handled during my consulting days. The international cybercriminal networks we tracked posed risks to financial systems, power grids, and communication infrastructure that could affect millions of people across multiple countries. The analytical challenges were complex and fascinating, requiring expertise that few people possessed. The personal rewards were equally significant. I had found my professional calling in work that genuinely mattered for national security and public safety. The technical challenges engaged every aspect of my analytical capabilities, while the mission provided meaning that sustained motivation through long hours and demanding security requirements. More importantly, I had learned to build a life that accommodated the unique demands of classified work without sacrificing personal relationships entirely. My new colleagues had become genuine friends who understood the isolation that security clearances could create. We supported each other through the challenges of maintaining connections with family members who couldn't fully understand what we did for a living. The dating landscape had improved dramatically in Washington, where classified work was common and respected rather than mysterious and questionable. I had begun seeing someone who worked in a different agency but understood the demands of federal service and security requirements. The relationship was developing naturally without the complications that had characterized previous attempts at romance. My apartment reflected the stability and confidence that had emerged from years of professional struggle and family misunderstanding. The space was comfortable and personal, filled with books about cybersecurity and technology alongside photographs of family celebrations where I was finally appreciated for my actual accomplishments rather than tolerated despite mysterious career choices. Looking back on the journey from family skepticism to federal recognition, I recognized how much the experience had shaped my understanding of professional validation and personal worth. The years of dismissal and misunderstanding had been painful, but ultimately strengthening, forcing me to develop confidence that didn't depend on external approval or social recognition. The FBI validation had been satisfying, but it had also highlighted how conditional family support could be. The same relatives who had questioned my career for years were eager to claim association with my success once it became publicly visible and socially respectable. The recognition felt good, but it also raised questions about the nature of unconditional love and family loyalty. Now, working at the highest levels of national cybersecurity, I understood that meaningful careers often required sacrifices that conventional success didn't demand. The invisibility and secrecy that had frustrated my family were essential elements of work that genuinely protected public safety and national security. The trade-offs were worth making for someone who found purpose in technical challenges in public service. The phone rang with a call from Agent Rodriguez, who had become both a professional mentor and personal friend during our collaboration on the original investigation. She was calling with news about another complex threat that required immediate analysis, the kind of challenging assignment that made every previous struggle seem worthwhile. As I prepared to dive into the next case, I thought about the unexpected journey that had brought me from family ridicule to federal recognition to meaningful work that utilized every aspect of my training and expertise. The validation had been important, but the work itself was the real reward. My family now understood and respected my career, but more importantly, I had learned that professional satisfaction didn't require their approval or anyone else's recognition. The work provided its own validation through technical challenges, public service, and collaboration with some of the most talented cybersecurity professionals in the country. The girl who had been dismissed as living in computer fantasy had become a federal analyst protecting critical infrastructure that millions of people depended on every day. The transformation had been gradual and often painful, but it had led to exactly the kind of meaningful career I had always hoped to build. The next case was waiting, representing new challenges and opportunities to contribute to work that genuinely mattered for national security. I was ready for whatever analytical puzzles lay ahead, confident in my abilities, and committed to protecting the digital infrastructure that kept modern society functioning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.